The presentation is an Amnesty report, and it is reporting on media freedom violations in the region, highlighting instances where journalists are targeted, media outlets are closed, and freedom of expression is curtailed. I will ask you to turn your attention to the big screen behind me for that report, which will be presented by Nokukanya Farise. She is a senior researcher and civic space East and Southern Africa at Amnesty International, a media team. If you could please play that video of the Amnesty report on media freedom and violations in the region. I think we are getting an overlap of the video as well as the, okay, there we go. Still, I think the two are still mixed for okay, you're just sorting that out. As they sort that out, as I mentioned, it is Nokukanya Farise, senior researcher in civic space for East and Southern Africa at Amnesty International. Her report will be looking at media freedom violations in the region, specifically highlighting instances where journalists have been targeted, media outlets have been closed, and freedom of expression has been curtailed. For those who are just joining us, if I could ask that you get to your seats as quickly as possible so that we can get into that presentation by Amnesty. And again, just a reminder that if you want to engage with this event, you want to give updates and comments, the hashtag is SAMS2025, SAMS2025. And you can make sure to tag HSTVZim on the various social and digital media platforms. I believe the video is now ready. So once again, a report.
Media organizations for 2 weeks in retaliation for their reporting on Nordin and Saro massacres. In Guinea, the government ordered the revocation of operating licenses for several radio and TV stations. So in sum, we're seeing that the pattern in the region was of serious human rights violations faced by journalists. And these fall into the following categories. The first is intimidation, harassment, and arbitrary detention. We saw that journalists reporting on corruption, human rights violations, or criticizing government policies often found themselves arrested or detained in some jurisdictions. Journalists face confiscation or removal of equipment or accreditation. Journalists faced being blocked from covering certain political actors or specific events. Journalists also faced censorship or forced suspension of media operations. Here we saw closure of media houses, programs, or removal of newspaper content considered critical of government. We also saw journalists facing serious violations to their right to life, where they experienced violence, threats, and even killings. This led in many contexts to self-censorship, where journalists, due to fear of reprisals because of vaguely defined laws around fake news, incitement, or any other kind of threats, ended up not freely being able to do their work and therefore self-censoring. I'll touch on a few examples very close to home in some of the countries in the region that we documented. Of course, we saw in the context of Mozambique, as I'm sure has been shared or will be shared by other actors present here today, serious human rights violations also targeting journalists. During the post-election protests, we saw that authorities targeted journalists covering protests. Some were arbitrarily arrested, and their freedom of expression was suppressed. We also again saw the shutdown of internet, or the restriction rather of access to internet in that context. For example, on 4 June 2024 in Mozambique, journalist Sheila Wilson was arrested while covering protests in Maputo. We also saw that STV journalists had their cameras seized and were physically attacked by police. We also saw that in Zambia, in October 2024, journalist Thomas Allen Dambo was arrested in Lusaka after publication of an article critical of government officials, and he was held without charge at the Ridgeway police station. In Zimbabwe, we also saw that on 24 February, Blessed Mhlanga presented himself to police after they had issued a public call for information on his whereabouts. He was arrested and charged with transmitting data messages that incite violence or damage property under the Cyber and Data Protection Act. His bail application was denied multiple times, and his first appeal was also rejected by the High Court. On 7 May, journalist Blessed Mhlanga was granted provisional release from prison. He had been detained for 72 days after being arrested and charged with transmitting data messages that incite violence or damage to property. Prior to his arrest, he had interviewed a war veteran and former senior member of the ruling party who criticized President Mnangagwa. His trial is currently ongoing. On 1 July 2025, Faith Zaba, the editor of the weekly Zimbabwe Independent, was arrested on allegations of undermining the authority of or insulting the country's president. The charge relates to a satirical article published in the weekly column, where Zaba was later granted bail in February, on Friday, 4 July, after having been compelled to spend 3 nights in custody, after the magistrate handling the matter said he had failed to type the ruling due to power cuts. So these are just some of the examples. There are many more of cases that we documented where journalists experienced direct attack by state authorities. But states have also used the law as a tool in attacking journalists. In 2024, authorities introduced or sought to introduce new restrictions on freedom of expression. States include Lesotho, others brought forward laws or bills that risk suppressing free speech or the banning of media outlets. So these laws fall into several categories. The first is national security laws or counterterrorism laws. So we saw governments using broadly defined security or terrorism legislation to target journalists. For example, accusing them of terrorism for reporting critical content. An example is in Eswatini or Swaziland, where we saw a Supreme Court decision in August 2024 upholding the Suppression of Terrorism Act, and also upholding certain provisions of the 1938 Sedition and Subversive Activities Act. These laws are overly broad and vague and used to label dissenters, journalists, critics as terrorists. And they threaten expression, association, and assembly. We also see laws around states of emergency used again to target journalists and media. In Ethiopia, the state used emergency rules to detain journalists arbitrarily, sometimes using charges that could carry the death penalty. Under the state of emergency, since 2023, at least 9 journalists have been detained. By early 2024, 5 remained in custody, and some face terrorism charges that could carry the death penalty. We also see states using defamation or the spread of false information or rumors or dissemination of fake news or incitement, laws that are worded in that way, used again also to target journalists. So these are often vague and used to shut down outlets or imprison journalists. For example, in DRC, we found that the spreading of false rumors or inciting revolt or defamation laws have been used to target journalists. We've also seen laws around cybersecurity or cyber crimes laws used to target journalists. For example, in Madagascar, they have a cyber criminality code and communication code, which vaguely defines fake news, incitement to hatred, or attacks on state security. And these have been used to intimidate or to punish journalists. Such cyber laws exist elsewhere, including, for example, in Zambia. So our key recommendations to authorities has really been ensure that journalists can do their job without fear of reprisals, because journalism is not a crime, and the role of media is critical in upholding human rights in our context. So we've been calling on governments to release unlawfully detained journalists immediately. We've called on governments to stop targeting the press for doing their job, and we've called on governments to end the misuse of the justice system to silence critics. Governments have been called upon to protect media freedom and expression via law reform, meaning that laws that curtail freedom of expression have no place in our societies. We've also called on governments to ensure accountability where journalists have experienced violations. And we've importantly also called on governments to protect internet freedoms and access to information. Finally, we've called on governments to create an enabling environment for journalists. This includes protections for accreditation, safety of journalists in conflict and non-conflict situations, and safeguarding media outlets from arbitrary closure or suspension, and enabling journalists to work without fear of reprisals. As Amnesty, we will continue to call on governments to uphold their human rights obligations, to ensure journalists can do their work, and we really hope that we can all work together to ensure that our region and the world at large pushes back against these authoritarian practices that seek to control information as a tactic for leaders to hold on to power, and so that we can push back against these and be able to have spaces where information can be accessed freely, as this is a human rights. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing more on the outcomes of this important convening. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity
from
to present this
Amnesty,
morning.
the Amnesty report by Nokukanya Farisi, we've just been hearing from. She's a senior researcher for civic space in East and Southern Africa at Amnesty International.